Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Just give everyone a minute to come in. This is the 2024-2025 Nyhan Prize winners celebration and conversation. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Liz Schwartz. I'm the Director of Communications and Strategy at the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy at Harvard Kennedy School. We administer the Nyhan Prizes every year with the founding support of David Nyhan's family. David was a longtime Boston Globe columnist and former Shorenstein Center fellow. And in his memory, his family and many friends endowed a prize to award journalism in the spirit of the kinds of work that David did, which was coverage of politics and public policy with a really strong focus on the voices of everyday people and the impacts of politics and public policy on their lives. And so in that spirit, we have awarded a prize for many years. And then this year I've just instituted an emerging talent prize as part of this program, partly because David was a really big advocate for mentoring young journalists. And so we wanted to kind of keep that spirit alive and give an award to somebody earlier in their career who is embodying a lot of the spirit and values that David had and encouraged in others. So in a moment, I will introduce our moderator, and she will introduce our two prize winners, Michael Harriot and Rose Conlon. But first, I wanted to thank the judges for this year's prize for their work and attention to this process. They were Sean Donnan, who is the 2023 Nyhan Prize winner and senior writer for economics at Bloomberg News, Nick Nyhan, who is the son of David Nyhan and a longtime supporter of this prize and the process, Thomas Patterson, who's the Bradley Professor of Government and the Press at Harvard Kennedy School, and Cynthia Tucker, who's the 2012 Nyhan Prize winner, syndicated columnist, and journalist in residence at the University of Southern Alabama. Cynthia has kindly agreed to moderate this conversation. So Cynthia, I will turn it over to you. Unless we lost Cynthia. All right, I will introduce Michael and Rose. Cynthia was having a little bit of internet problems earlier, so hopefully she pops right back up. So Michael Harriot is the winner of this year's David Nyhan Prize for Public Policy Journalism. He is an award-winning journalist, best-selling author, poet, and public historian. He has long stood at the forefront of incisive, unflinching journalism that unpacks the complexities of race, power, and policy in America. He was previously a reporter at Ebony and also The Root, and has written for The Guardian, and is most recently a columnist at TheGrio. His most recent book is the New York Times bestseller, Black AF History, The Unwhitewashed Story of America, which has been called an authoritative, essential work of U.S. history. In 2022, he co-created the Webby award-winning podcast, Drapetomatics. You're going to have to remind me how to pronounce that, Michael. Unshackled History with Pharrell, and is a former Emmy nominee and 2019 fellow at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. He's been honored by the National Association of Black Journalists, the New York Association of Black Journalists, the American Library Association, as well as other honors. And in 2025, he founded Contraband Camp, a digital collective bringing together America's most celebrated journalists, artists, and scholars to speak truth to power. So Michael, congratulations. And then Rose Conlon is our first ever emerging talent prize winner, Nyhan Prize winner. She is a reporter for KMUW and the Kansas News Service, which is the Wichita public radio station. She brings fearless and deeply empathetic lens to some of the country's most contested policy issues, particularly women's health, reproductive rights, and rural healthcare access. Her reporting has shed a critical light on the rising incidence of pregnancy-associated domestic violence in Kansas and exposed dangerous gaps in nursing home corporations and public decision makers to account. Her work is frequently featured on NPR, and she's part of a new partnership between NPR and the Religion News Service to provide in-depth coverage of faith and spirituality. She's native of Washington State and now lives in Kansas. So thank you both for being here. Let's just start off with, while we're waiting for, I think Cynthia's internet just kicked off on her completely, but she's going to try to dial. So can we just, I would love to just start off with, Michael, can you start with by telling us a little bit about sort of your path to journalism and what made you kind of focus on the areas that you most cover?
Well, so I was originally I earned a bachelor's in mass communications and a master's in macroeconomics and in international business. So I started writing about, global economics for magazines. That's when these things called magazines that were actually paper existed. And I would write for magazines. I think, the first one I ever wrote was an article explaining like why so many people were buying gold. And, over the years, I think editors liked the way I kind of broke, things down from, this long view of 50,000 feet to make it digestible and understanding to the public, to a novice reader who didn't understand the intricacies of economics or policy. And I think that's because I've always been interested in like taking things apart and figuring out how they work, and then trying to, figure out like not just saying if this thing happens, it's because something that happened yesterday, but usually it's because of a policy decision or a decision that affected something else that affected us now. And it's always interesting to me that, as journalists, we oftentimes don't go back to the origin story of this thing that happened and inform the public of like we made the choice for why this thing exists today. And I think that is what my value has always been and what I've always valued about journalism. I think you're on mute, Liz.
I am. Sorry about that. Rose, I'd love to hear a little bit too about what brought you to journalism and what kind of inspired you to take this career path, especially these days.
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, I've always been a huge public radio fan, grew up listening to it in the back seat of my parents' car. And I think one thing that I've really loved about public radio is that it really allows people to kind of share their story in their own voice. You end up hearing a lot of voices of people who you might not encounter in your everyday life. Maybe you don't know someone who has a certain experience, and you're able to, hear them on your morning commute. So I ended up working at Marketplace for the first few years after I graduated college. And I was helping to produce the morning show there primarily. And I think one thing that was special about Marketplace is, I think what Michael was saying, it really did try to explain these kind of abstract economic concepts in sort of digestible, relatable kind of bites that people could access. And it didn't take, an economics degree to understand it. And then when I came out to Kansas, I was really interested in sort of covering what the overturning of Roe v. Wade was going to mean for people across the country. Kansas was and still is a pretty pivotal abortion access destination for people from across the country. And so, yeah, I've tried to really, I guess, prioritize explaining what that policy means for people, and also looking at other issues like women's healthcare, rural healthcare, nursing home oversight issues.
Great, thank you. For both of you, can you tell us a little bit about the thing that you're most proud of, a story or particular piece of work? Maybe Michael's case, could be a broad range of things of different mediums. But what's something you feel like you're really proud of that maybe fits in the spirit of this award that you've been given for journalism that kind of focuses on people the impacts.
Well, yeah, that's a long. There's a lot to choose from, but I think one of the things that I'm proudest of, and Rose might have heard of this, is that I started covering a case in 2017. It originally started. I was a young journalist cover. It started in 2017. I was covering for another young journalist. They were out of work, and so I was doing what we call aggregating. A story already exists, and our audience doesn't know about it. So I was basically writing a summary of this guy who was getting out of prison after serving 23 years that he didn't commit. And I got an anonymous email from what turned out to be a federal agent that says, "Hey, you don't know how deep this story goes." And it turned out that since the 1970s, there had been a cop who had been preying on, sexually assaulting Black women and murdering them and dumping their bodies around a Kansas City, Kansas neighborhood for 50 years. Had never been caught, charged, retired, went to another police force, and nothing had happened to him. And I went to Kansas, talked to these Black women who had been experiencing this for years, and did these two 10,000 word pieces. And one day I was in Los Angeles covering another story and got a call from the new attorney general. Says, "Hey, we're outside of Roger Golubsky's house about to arrest him now." And so that's one of the stories that, I was proud. I don't think of it as me covering it, but giving those women access to the public to tell their stories over 5 decades is something I am proud of.
Thanks. And Rose, how about you?
Yeah, I think that one thing that I'm proud to have worked on and to continue to work on is reporting around nursing home issues. I think that it's an issue that I think a lot of us, it's kind of out of sight, out of mind for a lot of us. I think as a society, we're sort of scared of aging and don't like to think about it a lot. And so I think often, nursing homes are where some of the most vulnerable people in our society live. And a lot of the time, they don't have someone advocating for them. The ones who do are the lucky ones, and those are usually the ones that are able to be profiled more easily because, they have a family member who is reaching out to journalists, reaching out to lawmakers to try to enact change. And so I think that, this is an area that I really hope to continue doing more reporting and focus on in some capacity. Just making sure that, these institutions that are entrusted with caring for some of these super vulnerable people are accountable, that, state governments are, giving them adequate oversight, that state governments have the money to give them adequate oversight, and that we're also thinking, broader about the rising costs of long-term care. This is something that's going to become increasingly costly, especially as, humans are living longer. And so, I think that I'm glad to sort of be able to give voice to some of the people who are really experiencing those issues firsthand.
Thanks. Yeah, both of those are great examples of the kind of work that I think you have been honored with this prize for. So thanks for talking about them a little bit. Michael, you've got a huge history of reporting and sort of creating media in lots of different mediums. So you're a writer, you're a podcaster, you're a columnist, you're a reporter. What do you find is the thing that speaks to you most? And also, where do you find that your audience is kind of connecting with the kinds of stories that you're telling these days?
I think, my through line is that I, value taking a story that people who might be my audience, usually it's a Black audience. I've worked most of my career in Black media, and kind of breaking it down. One of the things I talk about a lot is race. And I think that so often we think of race and racism as the same thing, right? And we have these, I think, intentionally intertwined views and definitions that are largely untrue. And so, I always tell people that here's what I here's how I envision what I write, whether it is for a book or a newspaper article or for I've written for TV shows. I think of myself as someone who, imagine if you were in a room, and I think everybody has experienced this, if you're in a dark room or room with the door closed and you've heard something or felt the draft, and you turn to the person next to you and they say, "Do you feel that?" And the people next to you say, "Well, you must be crazy." And I think of myself as telling black people and speaking not for black people, but to black people to let them know you're not crazy. Like if this world tells you, like, I don't feel that discrimination or I don't feel that disparity, you're not crazy. Here's the data. It's a common thing across this country throughout history. And I think that is the thing that I try to do.
Thanks. I think we may have Cynthia back by phone, so I'm going to see if we can pull her in here because I know she had a couple of great questions that she wanted to ask you in addition to the couple that I did. So let me just see. Cynthia, I think you're on mute. If you unmute, you may be able to hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Let me apologize. First of all, this was the worst possible time for my internet to completely go out. But I have enjoyed what I've heard of the conversation. So let me pick up with what Michael was talking about, because I have spent my career doing some of the same thing. And I would like to ask Michael, do you believe that that kind of work has made a difference? And if so, what difference?
Well, I think one of the things it does is it does let people know that, right? Like I can keep saying and speaking out, saying what I believe. I can keep speaking out because I now know that I'm not the only one who feels this way. But we've seen measurable results from some of the effects of journalism. Not just a guy like Roger Golubsky being arrested, but I did this series on Morehouse College and how they'd kicked their students off of the faculty board, off of the board of directors, and the students were protesting, and it led to the dismantling of the entire university board. So, measurable results like that. I've written about. I started writing about the child separation policy. And Congress, one of the congressmen read something I wrote and said, I'm going to hold a hearing after reading this on the child separation policy, and got the administration to change that child separation policy. So I think a lot of times it is, I think having people and being the conduit for people to tell their stories and get their stories to the public, because naturally everybody who lives in the world has one perspective. They can only see what they see and experience, and once you get to see and feel someone else's experience, it enlightens you and might get you to change your mind or might cause a change in public policy.
I agree completely. I think that that's why journalists do the work we do. And I'd like to ask Rose a question. Rose, you have also spent much of your career writing about people whose voices are less heard. And I was particularly intrigued by the story that you did on the pilots who fly women who need abortions to states where abortions are still accessible, and they do it for free. And that is such a polarizing subject. I wonder how you cultivate sources. The same thing with nursing homes, with people who haven't been cared for well in nursing homes. How do you get people to talk to you about subjects like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a long process. And I think it's something that I've found easier being a more local and state-focused reporter than when I was working for a big national show like Marketplace, because you really are able to sort of embed in the community, keep those relationships over time, and sort of show that you are committed to covering the issue over time. I think that as far as the pilot organization, Elevated Access, that was a story that I'd been wanting to do for a while at that point. I think that I'd been aware of them pretty much since Roe was overturned, but it was another 9 months before I was able to go out with the pilot and sort of make that story work. And so, yeah, I guess it, takes a lot of following up with sources, being diligent, setting a reminder on your calendar every few weeks to go check back in with that person. And I think it also requires you to, you know, be someone that people can trust, that they're going to be able to tell you their story and you're going to treat it with respect and give it the time and attention and framing that is required, and not maybe sensationalize it, even when it's a story that could be sensationalized. And so, yeah, I definitely try to kind of continue to practice that. I think also when you're working with sources who are maybe not media trained, they're a pilot who has never talked to the media before, or they're, the family member of a nursing home resident who, was mistreated. I think that I always try to be really open about how their story is going to be used, and also sometimes, especially when you're thinking about someone who might have dealt with abuse or a situation where they lost power, to try to, give them back some of that power through the interview and reporting process. So, just being very transparent about how their story is going to be used, giving them options about, we don't have to talk about this if you don't want to talk about this, or we can come back later and talk about this if it's feeling like it's too much right now. So yeah, that's definitely something that I continue to try to get better on and practice in my reporting.
I think that is so important. You're talking about trying to help people who are not used to media attention understanding how the story will be used. And you talked about people who've been abused, because you also had a powerful story about women who are subjected to domestic abuse. And they must trust you because you did get access. So did it take you a long time on that one as well?
Well, that was a situation where a woman had died, which it became clear was due to intimate partner violence. And her family members were talking to the media. It was sort of a big story locally here. But in our conversations, at some point, her family members started sharing with me their own experience with abuse. And so, yeah, I think that was something that I didn't know that was going to be part of the story until after I started talking to her and, digging into her thoughts and reflections on, in this case, her goddaughter's death. And yeah, I think that's something that I think first when she disclosed it, I wasn't sure if it was going to be in the story, because I wasn't sure if she was comfortable with that. But at a certain point, it did make it into the story, and she was comfortable with that. And I think it was really, an integral part of the story.
Well, kudos to you for that. I'm going to throw to each of you a sort of big picture question because it's something I've spent a great deal of time thinking about over the past few years in our current political environment. So, Michael, you're, I started to say old hand. I'm not going there. You're a practiced hand at this. How do you believe that the First Amendment is under threat? There seems to be a lot of intimidation of journalists at the moment, and intimidation of people just for sharing an opinion in news media. Is the First Amendment under threat? Is there more intimidation of journalists than there used to be?
Oh, so yeah, I think the First Amendment is under threat. I think all of them are under threat. I think like all of the entire Constitution is. I constantly say like everything is just words on paper unless it is enforced, right? Like anybody can write a law. If you don't enforce a law, then is it a law, right? We see that with extrajudicial murders. We see a judge say, bring this guy back from overseas, and he's still overseas. So I think the entire, like all of the rules don't matter unless they are enforced. And so the First Amendment, like all others, is a rule that is under threat. And I think that we don't know how much of a threat we are all under, and we can't unless we protect the First Amendment, right? How will you know? Like, you'll still be able to go to work, right? Most of the people in Nazi Germany, their lives didn't change, right? Same with Italy, same with most, fascist or totalitarian regimes. Their lives don't change. And a lot of times they don't know what's going on because the government intimidates or controls the media. So once the First Amendment falls, everything else can fall. We're going to start seeing stories in the next couple of weeks about real intimidation of journalists, multiple journalists being audited by the IRS. We're going to start seeing that. And so it's under threat because this entire democracy and the paper that it's written on isn't worth the paper that it's written on unless we enforce it.
So, Rose, I'm going to throw the question to you. As you mentioned, you do a lot more local and state reporting, but you still are covering issues that some people in power get very angry about. Do you feel any sense of threat or intimidation? Do you believe the First Amendment is under siege?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely do. There's a lot of concerning things happening right now. When it comes to state and local issues, I mean, I think one challenge is that a lot of times local outlets have trouble getting records, and I think there's been an increasing trend in government agencies refusing to provide records or delaying or making those records prohibitively expensive to obtain. And I think as we see a lot of local news outlets losing money, dwindling down to very small staffs, there just are not the resources to fight those battles in a lot of cases. I think in the past, a lot of times news organizations would band together to pay for a lawyer to sort of fight those battles for them. And now there's maybe, one or two local news orgs that are covering a certain issue in a given place. And so I think that is something that also really influences what people are able to write about, even if it isn't, a direct commandment about you should not write about this topic. I guess I personally haven't gotten any feedback or any feeling that I'm being personally investigated for writing about a certain topic, but I do know that some of my colleagues have expressed concerns about that at various times, and it definitely, I think, being a journalist in this environment is something that you have to be increasingly cognizant of. I always think about, having to make sure that my, all of my passwords are on lock. I think that journalists should always take precautions when it comes to their personal safety, their personal digital safety, that sort of thing.
Well, what you were saying about the loss of news outlets, particularly local news outlets, leads me to the next big picture question I will ask each of you. And Rose, since you provided such a great segue, I'll start with you. What do we do? What can we do? Is there anything we can do about the seed of misinformation?
Yeah, that's really hard. Oh, sorry, was there a second part to the question?
No, I was just hoping you had an answer for us.
I don't know if I have an answer, but it's really concerning, especially as someone who also focuses on health reporting. I think health misinformation continues to grow, and it's definitely a concerning trend. And I do think in part it might be a reflection of some inadequacies in how health media and health officials have been communicating to people about health. I think there have definitely been missteps and cases in which I think officials have not trusted people to make decisions based on information that should have been public throughout history, really. And
well, say a little more about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that, when we think about the pandemic and the initial messaging about masks, I think that was one clear example where I think that maybe officials did not have trust that people would do the correct thing with information about masks and the knowledge that masks actually do reduce transmission of COVID. And, the goal, of course, was saving those masks in that initial period for healthcare workers and first responders, which was, an important goal. But I think that we were also in a crisis, and there was a lot of information that was coming out, a lot of misinformation. I guess I think when it comes to covering misinformation and trying to address it, I think that it's a continual challenge and something that I think news organizations have to continue to put resources into. I think things like, public editors or reporters who are really embedded in different communities and who are really listening to the individual concerns that those communities have are really essential to helping to combat misinformation and ensure that officials are fully aware of how people are experiencing the impact of their policies. I wish that there was an easier solution, but yeah, I think I'm curious what Michael has to say and if he has any thoughts.
Michael, how do we deal with misinformation?
Michael, you're on mute.
So to a certain point, I don't think there is much that we can do about it as journalists, right? I used to have a professor that used to tell us about this thing called the necessity of existence, right? Sometimes, right, what you're writing or what you're reporting on as a reporter might not be a thing that's in the news or anything that is important now. But because it exists in the public space, on paper, on the internet, when people are searching for the truth, you have provided a resource that might matter 3 years from now, right? And when it comes to misinformation, right? Like, there is nothing that I can say if you can respond, yeah, that's what they want you to believe, or yeah, I don't believe it, right? Like here's an example, right? So I'd written a thing about the newest budget proposals that came out, and I mentioned that they were cutting clean water for the EPA's service that provides clean water. And someone says, yeah, well, in black run cities, they always mess up the water supply, and then they want white people to fix it or blame white people. And I said, well, I provide the resource. Say these are the 10 cities with the cleanest water in America. 8 of them have black mayors. When you're talking about Flint, there was a white mayor in charge of Flint when that water crisis happened. They switched to the water source. And when you're talking about like Jackson, Mississippi, the first time they elected a black mayor, he did an audit of the city and realized, oh, they have really been screwing up our water supply. And that guy's response was, I don't believe you. So there is nothing else you can do, right? Like, you put the correct information out there. You can't combat the people who will never believe, no matter how much truth you put onto the internet, no matter how well you source it, no matter if you talk to the scientists, no matter if you show them the water molecules under a microscope, they will always have their point of view. And there's nothing I can do about that. But during that argument, 10 other people who might have thought the same thing said, but had an open mind about it because they've been told the same thing, right? That guy didn't make that up. They realized the truth, right? So you can't fight the misinformation, but because that thing now exists, other people will understand it. So I think that is what journalists should strive for, right? Like an unflinching adherence to the truth. And because you put it out there, it will inform more people.
I like that hopefulness. I do hope that is true. A friend, a coworker, and someone I have written several pieces with and a book calls it bearing witness. He says all we can do is bear witness to the truth. And I do hope that makes a difference in the long run. I now want to see if Rose, do you have any questions for Michael?
Yeah. I guess one of my questions, is somebody that thinks a lot about the impact of journalism and who also sometimes feels that we can continue to publish stories about an issue, and sometimes it feels like not a lot gets done about that issue. Maybe they don't make an impact. I know that you're somebody that has been able to have, a pretty powerful impact throughout your career. I was wondering, does that factor into sort of how you select stories, how you choose what to go after, and how do you think that you've been able to be so successful in that arena? I think you're muted.
I think, in selecting stories, I don't necessarily think of their impact or the popularity, right? I think of the need for the story, right? Like, this is a thing that people need to know, or this is a space or a hole in the coverage of this issue, right? And people might need that resource. It might just need to be on the internet or in a magazine. So, for instance, right, if you're talking about like some of your coverage on nursing homes, I honestly had never thought about how nursing homes work or what the issues were there. But when you read that stuff, it also gets you to thinking about, like, we never think about mortality or how, like, we're the population, because we're living longer, and because of medical advancements, people are living longer. So we're going to have more older people living longer, and how that what that's going to mean to us economically and financially. So I think exploring areas that nobody is talking about is important, and I think they also have an impact, because you might write a story that everybody is talking about, right? And because everybody is talking about it, right, you might have 1 million readers, but they can go read your story or a story in the Washington Post or the New York Times, right? But if you do a story that only 100,000 people are talking about, but there is no one else talking about that issue that affects those 100,000 people, then all of those people are going to read it. And all of those people, you're having an impact in a space where nobody was talking about a thing, that because it wasn't popular, it didn't have a lot of impact. So I think, going the places and doing the work that other journalists aren't willing to talk about or go, because it's not popular, right? Because it's not incendiary, or because it's not everybody's not talking about it on the internet. There is a space for us to do those things because it needs to exist, right? And even though it might not, be the first story on the evening news, sometimes, right, you are the only resource for those people who need the thing that they care about to be said. And I think that's what's been my guiding light into how I choose to cover something, and what that coverage needs to be.
Yeah, that's really helpful to think about. Thank you.
Yeah.
So, Michael, you have a question or two for Rose, don't you?
Yeah, I think I've always been interested in origin stories, and especially migration stories, and like you going from Washington State to Kansas is fascinating to me because of a number of reasons. One of the most, liberal, as we think of it, states, to a state that is a pretty red state, and how you found that, and if your job took you there, or did you intentionally choose to go to Kansas?
Yeah, well, so I grew up in Washington, and then I went to college in Southern California. So I was living in Southern California pretty much immediately before I moved to Kansas. And I think that, it was a point at which I was sort of feeling like I wanted to do more local reporting. So that was already something that I was considering. And I was just kind of, thinking about where I wanted to do that. And then as I was sort of going through that process, Roe v. Wade was overturned. And that was something that I was just really interested in covering what that was going to mean. So, yeah, of course, there were various places where that was really playing out in local communities. Kansas was the first state to vote on abortion after that decision. And it's also a state that has fielded a huge influx of abortion patients from other states. I think that Wichita is actually one of the closest clinics for pretty much all of Eastern Texas. And so, including, there are some places where New Mexico is closer, but it's been a really pivotal place to report on that and think about those issues. And so, it's been really interesting. I think also culturally, I think you were kind of talking about what it's like. It's definitely been, I think it has definitely made me a better journalist, a better person, to go from a place where a more homogenous sort of political worldview in my hometown, and also where I went to college, to a place where there's a lot more diversity of opinion. There's just, I think, a lot of richness that I've gained through moving.
Can I get one more follow-up question?
Yeah.
Yeah, like, so,
Please,
yeah, I think that a lot of times we think of, because the coverage we read nationally is from like the coast, from California, from New York, from DC. And I'm wondering, did it change your perspective on, like, do view it as like, now I live in America, and it doesn't change your perspective on where you came from and like all of those opinions that you read. Because sometimes even being on the liberal side, I look at the coverage and think, oh, they really don't know how America is, like in the South and in the Midwest. So I'm wondering how it changed your perspective on America and how the news coverage covers America.
Yeah, I mean, it's made me more critical, I think, of news coverage. I think that, yeah, I do think that sometimes journalism does not meet the mark in terms of understanding what is going on. And I think, I mean, of course, a great example of that was the 2016 election that I think a lot of news organizations and journalists did not predict, but the signs were there. And I think that was a story that, yeah, that news organizations could have gotten better. Probably also this last election in terms of, I think, some of the shock that was around in a lot of organizations. I do think that, yeah, I think that there's really no substitute for being in a community and sort of continually forming relationships and, you know, seeing your sources at the grocery store and sort of forming that trust in an organic way. And I do think that that is lost when there are reporters who sort of, I guess, parachute into a community to cover a given story. So, yeah, I definitely think that local journalism is really crucial. And I think that having more local journalists who, you know, are doing that sort of work and who are also collaborating to help cover the national stories, right? Because a lot of these stories are national, especially when it comes to national politics. I think that that's something that I'd like to see more of.
Rose, I have to agree with what you just said, 110% about national news media, because I currently live in Mobile, Alabama, and I teach at the college level. And when I see stories in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal talking about what's happening in colleges, I think, what are they talking about? It's not happening at my college. With all due respect to Harvard, I love Harvard. I did a Neiman. I was a Nyhan winner, so of course I love Harvard. But it is not representative of the broader college landscape. And I just wish reporters would spend less time in Boston, New York, and DC, and more time in actually living in and reporting from the rest of, I'm not going to call it the real America because all of it is America.
Yeah.
But the rest of America. Liz, do we have questions from the audience?
We do, and wholeheartedly agree with that last point you just made, Cynthia, as well. Actually, I think this first question really nicely ties into the conversation you were just having, which is from Carmen. And she says, good journalism is more important than ever, so thank you to both of you. Yet Americans continue to register record low trust in mass media, according to Gallup survey data, and I think many others. She asks, as journalists who excel in people-centered journalism, do you both have advice for what journalists and audiences alike can do to improve trust in the news?
So having worked with like on polling data, like I've seen that question a number of times, and it doesn't really kind of reflect people's opinion because like everybody has a bad opinion of the media. Like if I have a bad opinion of the media, right? But right, we get our news, like we have trust. Everybody has trusted sources. It might be Fox News, right? But they don't consider, like, people who watch Fox News, the most watched television cable news network, right? They don't consider that mainstream media, right? And so they say that's my truth, and the rest of the media is lying. And then people who read the New York Times say the opposite. So like people trust the media, like people trust their specific choices and their specific sources, and then they also trust like objective local journalism, right? NPR, right? Like people trust the NPR station, right? Like it has one of the most broadest political bases. I was talking to a colleague about, the attack on public radio, and I was like, yeah, like it's wild because, like, even though they might lean left, they kind of lead toward truth, but it's like the least radical audience, right? Like everybody loves their NPR, right? And so I think, again, that distrust is indicative of a political environment. And I don't, and I hesitate to even say that because I think that I hate the narrative that America is so divided now, or it's more divided than it's ever been, because there is a certain group of privileged, let's face it, white people who got to control the narrative, and you never heard black people's side of the story, and you never heard of immigrant side of the story. And now that you're hearing them, you say we're divided when all of these people thought all of these things all the time. But now that you hear them, you think this country is divided, and it's always been two Americas or three Americas or however many we want to ascribe this division to.
Rose?
Yeah,
Trust in me?
I think that's a really important point. I think that, news organizations do sometimes lose trust. I think that when you're not really investing in issues that people care about, a lot of news organizations are laying off reporters, losing staff. And I do think that it really requires investment and money to produce quality journalism. And I think the funding model might sort of be partially to blame for that. But I also think that, I think that news organizations do have to continually strive to be better and to more accurately reflect their audiences, and to make sure that they're not leaving voices behind, that they do have reporters who come from those communities who are being left behind, who are there to, report on stories that matter, and that it's not just, people coming in and speaking to communities. So,
I would also like to note that local journalism tends to be trusted more, local news outlets, by the people who live in those communities. But we're also losing local news outlets faster, particularly newspapers. Liz, are there other questions?
Yeah, picking up on that point, there's a question from Natalie, who says, what new trends do you see or hope to see in terms of citizen journalism? She says, I'm a documentary filmmaker and wonder if my field should turn our attention to covering stories on the ground in real time in this moment. Any suggestions, tips, or advice?
Michael?
I think citizen journalism has always been important. I think, we have so many tools today that allow stories that we would have never heard to be seen and heard. And so, I think that is a new frontier. I also always hesitate to kind of say, like, we need to also understand that, like, a lot of the commentary and, the things that we shove under the context of journalism is different. If you take someone like Rose, for instance, who has been on the ground covering, issues, and then they go into later in their career, becoming a commentator. That commentary is informed by years of on the ground grassroots journalism in communities. And so when we see commentary from people who have, frankly, never submitted a FOIA request or never had to develop a source, and they've read what other journalists write, and that's what has informed their opinion. I think we just have to, as a public, understand that there is a difference between those two things, just as there is a difference between a aunt who can really cook and a chef who runs a restaurant, right? Like both of them have a really developed talent, but they are two different things, even though we might love them both.
Yeah.
I am sitting nodding my head, Michael. Go ahead, Rose, please.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. And I think that, I mean, part of when we're talking about reduced trust in media, I think there is a feeling by a lot of people that editors at these major news outlets have an agenda and are pushing that agenda on their reporters. And so the coverage is filtered through that agenda. And I think that when you're talking about citizen journalism, I mean, everybody has an agenda. And I think that when you're talking about, maybe one person who is, who becomes really popular, like on TikTok or something, I think it's important for consumers to be media literate, to understand that they might also have an agenda, and it's probably less diffuse than, a big news organization. But that also means that there are certain strengths where they might be able to recognize stories that are not getting attention, elevate issues that are not getting attention. And I think that they also have a really important role in the media landscape today.
Thank you.
One more. Go ahead, Cynthia.
Sounds good, Liz. We have time for one more.
I think just one more quick one, and this relates to what you were all just saying. It's like the questions are just rolling right from what you're asking, which is that Robert is sort of asking about the role of social media for journalists to report. So I'm curious, building on his question, also about how the two of you are thinking and using social media these days for your reporting, for distributing. Any of that, how has that changed, or what are you thinking about since so many people are kind of going to social media for information, but it is a minefield?
I guess,
Rose, you want to take first?
I can just say a little bit. I'm probably not as much on social media as I should be. I've kind of fallen off on Twitter and I guess X now. But I do think it's really vital, and it's basically where people are consuming their news, and in a lot of cases. And I think it's really crucial for news organizations to be on social media and to be exploring some of these more innovative platforms for telling stories. I think in a lot of cases, there are journalists who are really skilled at doing this, and I'm excited for them to be getting more attention and, be elevating some of these different mediums. So I guess that's in terms of distribution. And then when you think about sourcing on social media, I think there's a lot of advantages there in being able to sort of take the pulse of a given issue in different communities on social media in a different way. So I think that's something that is sort of increasingly exciting.
Michael?
I think it's definitely helped me develop sources, or just helped sources who wanted their story told to find me, whether it's the family of someone who was, the victim of police brutality, but no one would tell their story, or, a student at a college who says this thing happened and no one will tell my story. I think that is a value of social media. But I also think that we also have to understand, like, we are writing in an environment where so much of the public consumes media that is not in long form, and that we provide you can think something on social media, but what you have to, if you want the real information, there is a journalist, there is a source, there is an outlet that can explain it to you that you honestly can't get from social media, right? Like, you can't get context from social media, you can't get background from social media. And I think that is the difference. You can use social media to point people toward the service that journalists provide, right? But I think I don't worry about social media because it'll never be able to provide the context. And as long as we stay true to the form, to the notion of journalistic integrity and providing the truth, then I think what social media is a journalist tool that connects them to the public.
Michael, I try to teach that distinction to my students all the time. I try to help them understand how social media can be used, but it can't be relied on as their only source for current events. I want to say thank you so much to both of you. I want to say congratulations again. I want to say thanks to the audience members who listened in and asked such great questions. And I want to also apologize again for the fact that my technology just completely let me down today. But thank you for being patient with me. Liz?
Yes, thank you, Cynthia, for rolling with the punches on the technology front and finding your way back to us. And thank you and congratulations to Michael and Rose. And thank you for being here and having this really fascinating conversation that I want to just have over and over with you now, because there's so many interesting nuggets I'd love to keep the thread going on. But a little bit to that point, if those folks who are watching have journalists in mind who you think would be great honorees for this prize in the future, we'll be opening up nominations for next year's Nyhan Prize in June. So if you are not already subscribed to the Shorenstein Center's email list, please sign up. You can go to our website, shorensteincenter.org, and just scroll down to the bottom, drop your email in, and you will get an email notification when we open up those nominations. Nominations for this prize are open to anyone. Anyone on the public can nominate their favorite journalist who they think embodies the ideals of this prize, and they will be considered. So please keep an eye out for that. And Michael and Rose, thank you and congratulations once again.
Thanks again.
Thank you so much.